This is part two of the history of the Byzantine Church. So in the first part of the history of the Byzantine Church, we looked at a number of different controversies and heresies that arose during the early years of the Byzantine Church. So now we're going to look at another controversy that arose during the Byzantine Church. And this controversy is known as the iconoclastic controversy. And the key question for the iconoclastic controversy is the question of the veneration of icons. That is the veneration of icons the same as idolatry? Now, one thing we need to understand about icons is that in the Byzantine and Orthodox tradition, the veneration of icons is very common and it is very popular. If you go to the home of an Orthodox believer, you will likely find icons, maybe in a corner of their home, or maybe a picture on a wall, or maybe on a shelf. An icon might be set on a shelf. And certainly, if you go to an Orthodox church, you will almost certainly see many icons. In fact, in Orthodox churches, the front of the church is set apart from the rest of the church by a screen that is known as an iconostasis. And this iconostasis is made up of many, many icons. And so this screen separates the priest from the rest of the church. The priest during the worship service will perform certain actions and sing certain songs from behind that iconostasis screen. Okay, so when Orthodox people venerate icons, they may kneel in front of icons, they may cross themselves in front of icons, they may even kiss icon. So in this slide, that's exactly what we see. We see a man kissing this icon. And so this is an example of how common and how popular icons are in the Orthodox tradition. And so icons include paintings, frescoes, and ivory reliefs, but they usually refer to portable images, which can be found in Orthodox churches and in the homes of Orthodox believers. Okay. Now, some believe that the action of bowing down to icons and even kissing them are acts of idolatry, whereas those who defend icons would say that these are actions of reverence and not idolatry. They would argue, those who defend the use of icons would argue that these actions of veneration are not idolatry, but rather because the people who are doing these actions are not worshiping the images themselves, but instead they are worshiping the God whom these images point to. So therefore, they argue that these actions are not idolatry, because by kissing the icon, the person is showing their affection, their worship, not of the icon itself, but instead they are showing their worship for God. Okay. Now, one thing to be aware of is that throughout the history of the Byzantine Church and later throughout the history of the Orthodox Church, there have been many stories that have surrounded icons. So, for example, a certain icon might be associated with certain miraculous healings. Other icons might be associated with great victories in battle because, maybe the soldiers prayed, venerated this icon, or this icon was carried before the soldiers and the soldiers were able to win a great battle. So you find many of these stories in Orthodox regions of the world. And so this again illustrates just how common and how popular icons are in the Orthodox tradition. Now, those who defend the use of icons argue not only that icons are not idols, but they also argue that icons are necessary. And the reason why they argue that icons are necessary is because of the doctrine of the incarnation. What they argue is that because Jesus came to earth as a man, this means that the material world is part of God's good creation. And so icons, therefore, remind us that this physical world is part of God's good creation. And they would argue that icons also help protect us from the mind and spirit dualism that is that many Christians sometimes believe in, maybe even unconsciously. Back in Greek time, this mind-spirit split actually goes all the way back to ancient Greek times, because during ancient Greece, we had philosophers such as Plato, who believed that there is a world of eternal objects, perfect objects, and then there is this physical world, which is simply a shadow or copy of the eternal world. And so because of Platonism, because of the teaching of Plato, many people over the centuries and even over the millennia have this idea that the mind and the spirit are separate, and that the mind and that the spirit and the body are separate from each other. And so Orthodox people would argue that this kind of split is unhealthy. And in fact, many other Christians would agree that this split between the body and the spirit is unhealthy, that both are connected. But Orthodox Christians and the Byzantines before them would argue that icons help remind us that the mind, that the body and the spirit are connected, and that this physical world is part of God's good creation. And therefore, the worship, the veneration of icons is not only not idolatry, but it is also necessary. Okay. Now, those who opposed icons were known as iconoclasts, and they, as this controversy proceeded, sometimes the opposition to icons became quite violent, and the iconoclasts would go into churches and they would tear down icons, and many times they would actually burn icons. And so this happened periodically throughout the iconoclastic controversy. Iconoclasts would go into churches and they would tear down icons and claim that these icons were actually idols, and they would burn these icons. Now, the iconoclasm controversy lasted roughly 120 years, from 726 until 843. In 843, they were permanently restored by the Empress Theodora. So in 843, the Empress Theodora permanently restored icon to Byzantine churches. And that marked the end of the iconoclasm controversy. So what I want you to understand from all of this is that the use of icons in churches and homes is one of the distinguishing features of Byzantine Christianity, and it continues to this day in the Orthodox tradition. So, for example, we have this picture of a Russian home, and I'm guessing this picture was painted sometime in the 1800s, because this is a home made out of wood. It's a log cabin. But if you look in this picture, what do you see? Well, you see the husband sleeping on a bed, but what is his wife doing? His wife is kneeled on the floor, and up above the husband's bed in the corner of their house is a shelf. And on this shelf are different icons. And so this wife is praying in front of these icons. She is venerating them. And so this is an example of how icons continue to be popular even to this day. So if God ever calls you to an Orthodox country, such as Russia or somewhere in Eastern Europe, or if you ever visit the home of an Orthodox person or visit an Orthodox church, you will see icons. So just be aware of that. Okay, the next controversy I want to talk about is the Philoke controversy. This controversy actually led to the Great Schism. So what is the Philoke? Well, Philoke is a Latin phrase that means "and from the sun." This phrase was added to the original Nicene Creed and became a source of controversy between the Eastern and the Western churches. So the question in the Philoke controversy is this: does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father only, or does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father through the Son? Okay, so that is what's behind the Philoke controversy. Does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father only, or does it proceed from the Father through the Son? So this is actually a Trinitarian question. This controversy, the Philoke controversy, actually led to the Great Schism, which occurred in 1054. But the Philoke controversy was not the only reason why the Eastern and the Western churches split. There were several other reasons why the Eastern and the Western churches split. So there were a number of disagreements between the Eastern and the Western churches. These disagreements included whether to use the Philoke or not. So in Western churches, when they recited the Nicene Creed, they included the Philoke in the Nicene Creed. When the Eastern Church recited the Nicene Creed, they did not include the Philoke in it. So that was one source of disagreement between them. Another source of disagreement between them was whether to use unleavened bread or not for the Holy Communion. So some Christians believe that you should use unleavened bread during the Lord's Supper. Other Christians believe that you should use leavened bread during the Lord's Supper. And so this question also divided Eastern and Western Christians. Another question that divided Eastern and Western churches was the question of whether the clergy should remain celibate or not. In the Western church, Raymond talked about how there was a movement to make clergy the norm for all people, all church leaders, not just the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops and archbishops, but even ordinary priests were eventually required to be celibate. The Eastern Church, on the other hand, allowed their priests to remain married. And so this was another disagreement that Eastern Christians and Western Christians had. And yet another disagreement that they had was whether to use icons or not. So we just talked about how Eastern Christians use icons, and to this day, they still practice veneration of icons. In the West, Christians in the West do not use icons nearly as much. What you find are statues, especially like statues of Mary, or you have the statue of Christ on a cross in Catholic churches, but they do not venerate icons nearly to the extent that Eastern Orthodox people do. So this was another major controversy between the Eastern and Western churches. Now, not only were there some theological controversies between the Eastern and Western churches, there were also some major cultural and even administrative or organizational differences between Eastern and Western churches. So I prepared this chart for you that illustrates some of these other differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. So in the Western churches, they used Latin as the church language. And we find this lasting for thousands of years. The Eastern churches, on the other hand, used the Greek language as their church language. And what we'll see in the missionary expansion is that other languages became the church languages of the churches in Eastern Europe and Russia. But before the Great Schism, the Greek language was pretty much the church language that was used in the Eastern churches. So that's a major cultural difference right there. Western churches were centered on Rome, and Eastern churches were centered on Constantinople. So Rome was pretty much the center of the Western church. That was where the Pope lived. And Constantinople was the center of the Eastern church because that was where the patriarch lived. And that leads to the next major difference. The Western church was led by the Pope, and the Eastern church was led by the patriarch. Now, the Western church was influenced by the fall of the Roman Empire in AD 476, because after that point, the Roman Empire in the West collapsed. And there was a great power vacuum, as I mentioned earlier, and the church stepped into that power vacuum. And so the Pope began to have gained more and more power as he became involved in the affairs of Western Europe. Now, in the Eastern churches, on the other hand, we have a very different political situation, because in the Eastern Roman Empire, there was a continuation of Roman or imperial rule. And so because of that, as I mentioned earlier, the Byzantine emperors were often very active in the affairs of the Byzantine church. Another major administrative difference between the church in the West and the church in the East is that in the West, monasteries were centrally organized. what that means is there in the Roman Catholic Church, there has always been a very strong hierarchy where you have the Pope at the very top, then you have the cardinals, then you have archbishops, then bishops, then the priests, okay? And so monasteries were part of this hierarchy. And so monasteries were, all the monasteries were eventually administered by Rome ultimately. So yes, decisions were made at the local level, but they were still answerable to the Pope in Rome. Now, in Eastern churches, monasteries were not centrally organized. So monasteries had a lot more autonomy in Byzantine Christianity. And the same is true later in Orthodox Christianity. And so along with this difference in monasteries, what we find is in the West, monks lived in community. And so that meant that while monks did spend time in individual and personal prayer with God, they also spent time in community, doing community activities. For example, they would gather together at different times during the day to sing songs from the Psalms and to pray. They also would spend time eating dinner meals together. And sometimes they would also spend time out in the field doing work, doing farming and other activities. So they very much lived their lives in community. Now, monks in the Eastern churches were much different. They often lived in solitude. So it is actually quite common to hear about Eastern monks going off into the woods or living in caves or living somewhere else where there are very few people and living many years in solitude. And during this time, they really developed their personal relationship with God. So what we see is that these Eastern monks saw great value in solitude, while the Western monks saw great value in community. So it's not necessarily that one is better than the other, because each approach has its strengths and weaknesses. But these are two different ways that Christianity developed. And this is another major difference between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. Okay. So the Great Schism took place in 1054, and the actual date for the Great Schism was on July 16th, 1054, because it was on that day that the Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople was excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church. So the Roman Catholic Church excommunicated the Patriarch Michael Cerularius, and then the Eastern Constantinople responded by doing the same thing. The church in Constantinople responded by excommunicating Pope Leo III of the Roman Catholic Church. And this is called the Great Schism, because this marks the break between Eastern and Western Christianity. Now, what we're going to find is, especially when we look in the Crusades, is that there was still some contact and some communication between the Eastern Church and the Western Church after 1054. But because of the events of the Crusades, that split eventually became permanent and even deeper, okay? So after now, now that we've looked at different controversies, let's look at the spread of the Eastern churches. And what I want to talk about now is the missionary outreach to the Slavs. Okay, so in the 9th century, the Byzantine church sent missionaries into Eastern Europe, including places like Moravia, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Russia. Okay, so if you look at this map, you will see areas where the Byzantine church began reaching out. They began reaching out to areas like Bulgaria, Serbia in the Balkans, Moravia, which is located in the Carpathian Mountain, and Russia. Now, one key date, okay, 2 missionaries who were a major part of this missionary expansion into Eastern Europe were Cyril and Methodius. Today, they are known as Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. One of the reasons why these 2 men are so important in the development of Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe and Russia is because Cyril, they developed a new alphabet for the people of Eastern Europe and Russia because they grew up okay, so let me back up real quick. Cyril and Methodius grew up in Macedonia. And Macedonia is a province that is located just north of Greece, okay? So in Macedonia, they grew up there and they grew up speaking Slavonic, which is a Slavic language. Now, Cyril and Methodius took their dialect, Macedonian Slavic language, with them as they went into Eastern Europe. And while they were in Eastern Europe, they began proclaiming the gospel to the people of Eastern Europe. And they discovered that the people of Eastern Europe had no written language. They had a spoken language, but no written language. And so they created the Cyrillic alphabet. And so on this screen, I'm shown a children's book of Bible stories that is written in Russian. And I put this book here so that you will see an example of the Cyrillic alphabet, so that you can see an example of what Cyrillic looks like. And so this is what Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius did. They developed the Cyrillic alphabet. And this was a tremendous gift to the people of Eastern Europe and Russia because it gave them a written language that they could use. And to this day, the nations of Eastern Europe and Russia still use the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, if you look at the separate alphabet, you will find that not all of the Cyrillic alphabets are the same. Some languages have certain letters and other languages don't have those letters, but they all have very common language, very common letters, thanks to Cyril and Methodius. Now, one key date to keep in mind when talking about the expansion of Christianity into Russia is the year 988. Christianity entered Russia earlier. There had been some missionary activity in Russia earlier, but in 988, what happened was Vladimir, who was the leader of Kiev and the leader of the Rus in that area, Vladimir converted to Christianity in the year 988. And so that is a turning point in the history of Christianity in Russia, because that conversion is considered the official birth of the Russian Orthodox Church. In fact, in the year 1988, the Soviet Union, yes, which was still communist at that time, the Soviet Union celebrated the 1000th anniversary of the Russian Orthodox Church. And that is how important this event was in the history of Russia and in the history of the Orthodox Church. Okay, now, so that a little bit about the expansion of Byzantine and Eastern Christianity into Eastern Europe and Russia. So now let's talk about the sacking of Constantinople, which took place in April of 1204. So this happened during the Fourth Crusade, and there is a little bit of background that I need to mention before I tell you about the sacking itself. So throughout the Crusades, the path that many crusaders took led them through either Venice or Genoa, which are two cities located in northern Italy. And Venice and Genoa were major shipbuilding centers. They were also major seafaring cities. And so during the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders followed this path. They went through Venice, and and so in Venice, they asked for ships. And so what happened was a deal was made. The Crusaders promised to give money to the Venetians to build ships. And so the Venetians agreed to build a fleet for these Crusaders. And so what happened was, over the next 8 to 12 months, almost the entire city of Venice got involved in this project. So almost everyone in Venice became involved in one way or another in building this fleet of ships for these Crusaders. And so this means that a lot of money, a lot of resources such as wood and other materials, and a lot of manpower was invested in building this fleet of ships for these Crusaders. And so Venice was taking a huge gamble. They were gambling that these Crusaders would come back with loot so they could repay the Venetians for building this fleet of ships for them. And so after this fleet was built, the Crusaders then sailed down the Adriatic Sea, through the Aegean Sea, and on to Constantinople. And when they arrived at Constantinople, the leaders of Constantinople were very nervous, because during most crusades, the Crusaders would pass through Constantinople, or they would pass by Constantinople on their way to the Holy Land. And so the leaders of Constantinople, every time this happened, they would get very nervous, because they literally had a huge army of foreigners who were heavily armed, literally right outside the city gates, outside the city walls. And so that army, even though these Crusaders were supposed to be allies of Constantinople and allies of the Byzantine Empire, they were still a foreign army, heavily armed, and they were theoretically a potential enemy. And so when these Crusaders arrived in 1203, the leaders of Constantinople were very nervous. And so because these Crusaders wanted food, they wanted other help so that they could continue their crusade into the Holy Land. Now, because of a really bad series of miscommunication, tension built between the Crusaders and the people of Constantinople. And this tension kept building and building until finally in April of 1204, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople. Now, just before Constantinople was sacked, the Byzantine emperor and his family fled from Constantinople. And so the Crusaders then sacked Constantinople, and over a period of about 3 days, many citizens in Constantinople were raped, killed, and their homes were looted. It was absolutely tragic. And when the Pope heard about this, he condemned this action. But by then, it was already too late because the sack had already been completed. Now, when these homes, not only were homes looted, but so were museums and palaces. And so these Crusaders looted not only homes, but they also stole many famous works of art from Constantinople. This would be similar to the looting that we saw in Baghdad right after the completion of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so many famous works of art were looted were stolen in Constantinople. And these stolen works of art were later taken back to Venice. And in fact, if you go to Venice today, you can actually see some of these stolen works of art in Venice today. And so those stolen works of art that are in Venice today that's evidence that tells a story of how Constantinople was sacked in 1204. Now, as I said, the Byzantine emperor and his family fled Constantinople right before the city was sacked. And so they fled to another city. And so for about 60 years or so, Constantinople was actually ruled by the Crusaders. And so this sacking marked the beginning of the decline of the Byzantine Empire. And so over the next 2.5 centuries, the Byzantine Empire began to decline. And during this time, the Byzantine Empire gradually lost more and more and more territory until it was finally conquered in 1453. And so that's the last thing I want to mention about the Byzantine church was this Byzantine era came to an end in May of 1453 when the Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Turks took Constantinople. Now, Constantinople itself is actually in a very good geographic position because Constantinople is situated on a peninsula. That means it is surrounded by water on 3 sides. In addition to this, Constantinople during the Byzantine Empire had excellent sea and land defenses. So throughout the history of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople was under siege by Muslims numerous times. And yet the Muslims never succeeded in taking Constantinople until 1453. And so Mehmed, the Sultan Mehmed II, successfully took Constantinople on May the 29th, 1453. And after this point, Christians throughout what used to be the Byzantine Empire were now under Muslim rule. And this included places like Egypt, Turkey, Greece, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Now, the fall of Constantinople is important for some other reasons, not only because it marked the end of the Byzantine Church and the Byzantine era, but it also was important because after the fall of Constantinople, many people fled from Constantinople and other places in the former Byzantine Empire over to Europe. And this included many Greek scholars. And so these scholars brought over many Greek manuscripts, and they brought lots of Greek learning from ancient Greece and also the Greek New Testament. And so they brought all of this Greek learning with them to Europe. Many of them settled in Italy. And so as a result of the Greek knowledge that they brought with them, this helped provide the seed for the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy. And those Greek manuscripts of the New Testament helped to lay the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation, because Martin Luther and other leaders of the Protestant Reformation studied these Greek manuscripts very closely, and they used these Greek manuscripts to translate the Bible into German, French, and later on English and other European languages. So even though the fall of Constantinople was a tragic event, it did lead to the spread of this Greek knowledge from what was the Byzantine Empire and over to Europe. Okay, so now I want to give you a chance to look at some questions that will help you to reflect on the history of the Byzantine Church. So let me read these questions for you. Later, I'm going to post these questions on our discussion board on Populi. And so you will have a chance to discuss these questions among yourselves on Populi. So the first question is, the history of the Byzantine Church is full of theological controversies. Are theological controversies important? Why or why not? Now, the reason why I asked this question is because when you talk about theology, some people will say, don't bother me with theology. Theology is not important. Let's just get on with living the Christian life. But even though the Christian life is important, there is often a theological basis for what we do. So that's why I'm asking the question, are theological controversies important? Why or why not? The second question is, there was often a very close relationship between the Eastern Church and the Byzantine emperors. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of a close relationship between the church and the government? Now, we've already talked about this in an earlier lesson. So that's why I want to encourage you to look at the second half of question number 2. And that question is, what do you think should be the proper relationship between churches and the government? Okay, so we've already talked about the advantages and disadvantages of a close relationship between the government and churches. But now I want us to explore the question, what do you think should be the proper relationship between churches and the government? And then the third question is, what did you learn from today's lecture, and how will this affect your ministry? So I look forward to reading your responses to these questions, and I look forward to talking with you in class. And so if you have questions about this lecture, please go ahead and write your questions down and come to class ready to ask these questions. So I look forward to seeing you in class, and God bless.